Okay, boys and girls, we are ready for chapter 14 in The Monsters of Morley Manor. And that one is called Past Meets Present. And the picture you're looking at is just another pretty fall picture, a basket full of leaves. So, chapter 14. Despite the fact that I was exhausted, my mind was in such a whirl that I didn't know if I would be able to sleep or not. But the minute I hit the sheets, I fell into a sleep so deep it was like being dead. Good practice for what was to come, I suppose. I didn't wake up till noon. When I staggered out to the kitchen, I found Grandma standing at the counter, kneading some bread dough. Mr. Perkins was sitting on his perch eating an apple. He snarled at me when I came in. Obviously, Melissande's influence had worn off. In fact, the whole scene looked so normal that I began to wonder if everything that I thought had happened the night before had just been some weird dream after all. Grandma didn't hear me come in, of course. I went and stood next to her so I wouldn't startle her when she realized I was there. She jumped a little anyway. "Oh, good morning, Slug-a-Bug," she said cheerfully. "What did you two do last night? Sneak out and watch TV after I'd gone to sleep?" "Yeah, something like that," I said, looking straight at her. This was the best way to talk to Grandma Walker. She uses the way your lips move to help figure out what you're saying. "Is Sarah up?" I added. "She's in the bathroom. Why don't you pour yourself a bowl of cereal?" That sounded like a good idea. I'd been so tired when we got in that I had forgotten I was also starving. Mr. Perkins hissed at me as I went to the cupboard. The sound reminded me of Melissande's snakes. I wondered how she and Gaspar were making out with their quest to find a lawyer to help them save Morley Manor. Before I could worry about it too much, I heard the doorbell. Grandma didn't hear it, of course, but when I stood up and started toward the door, she said, "I'll get it, Anthony. You eat." While she was gone, Sarah came back into the kitchen. I was about to ask her if last night had really happened when Grandma came back, too. She had an odd look on her face. Melisande and Gaspar were behind her, Bob trotting happily at their heels. "These people say they're friends of yours," said Grandma, looking a little puzzled. "It may seem strange to some of you that she would let them in, but you have to remember that in Owl's Roost, Nebraska, people still leave their doors unlocked at night. We are not what you would call the crime capital of the world." "How did you make out?" I asked, jumping to my feet. Gaspar smiled. "Justice has triumphed. We obtained a temporary restraining order to stop the demolition. Morley Manor still stands." "Gracious," said Grandma. "What do you two have to do with Morley Manor?" Then she narrowed her eyes. Her hands began to tremble. "Gaspar?" she whispered. He looked at her curiously. She clutched at her heart. "Gaspar," she said again, and this time her voice sounded accusing. Gaspar looked at her even more intently. Suddenly his eyes grew wide. "Ethel?" he cried in astonishment. Grandma staggered and grabbed the back of the chair. Slowly she lowered herself into it. "Gaspar," she murmured. "Melisande. Bob?" What's going on here?" I asked, totally baffled. "That's what I want to know," said Grandma. She sounded terrified. Gaspar turned to me. "Your grandmother and I were once engaged to be married," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is you," Grandma said in awe. "But how is it possible? Where have you been?" "It's a long story," said Gaspar. "He's not kidding," I said. "Sit," said Grandma firmly. "Tell." We spent most of that afternoon at the kitchen table. There were two stories that needed to be told: what had happened to Sarah and me in the past 24 hours, and what had happened to Gaspar and the other Morleys over 50 years ago. Sarah, of course, wanted to know all about Gaspar and Grandma being engaged, but they seemed hesitant to talk about it, as if the topic was too painful to touch, and after a few questions, she gave up. I could tell it was upsetting them, she told me later. As for what had happened to the Morleys, well, we don't actually know all of the story ourselves, confessed Gaspar, and won't unless the Wentar is able to bring back not only my brother, but the clone that had pretended to be him for all those years. But I can tell you how it began. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. I was, as you know, both a scientist and a magician. It was considered a great scandal by those who had figured it out, put in Grandma Walker. Yes, and an even greater scandal when Big Brother here started going out with a woman so much younger than himself. Such is the way in a small town, said Melisande. It took me a moment to realize that the younger woman she was talking about was Grandma. Don't fool yourself, little Melisande, said Grandma sharply. I've lived in the big city, and people there gossip just as much as small-town folk. More, probably. It's just that you have to be better known to get gossiped about by the right people. Go on, Gaspar. I'm eager to hear why you broke my heart. Breaking your heart was the last thing I ever intended, said Gaspar, reaching out to take her hand. Can we skip the romance and just tell the story? I asked. I was trying to get used to the idea of Grandma being younger than Gaspar, since she now looked 30 or 40 years older than him. But then, she had kept on living for the 50 years that the Morleys had been frozen. Gaspar nodded, his face no longer that of a great lizard, but that of a lean, handsome man. I wondered if Grandpa Walker had known about this, which got me to wondering what it would have been like if things had worked out differently and Gaspar had actually married my grandmother. It was too weird to wrap my mind around. Our real troubles started when I discovered the secret of the starry doors, he said. I was angry because I realized Martin had known it for some time and had not shared it with me. Of course, that was when we still thought Martin was our real brother. Gaspar sighed. It changes so much to know the truth, and we haven't had time to think through all that it means. Anyway, since Martin had not told me what he was doing, I returned the favor and did not tell him what we were up to. But with Ludmilla, Melisande, Albert, and Bob at my side, I began to explore other worlds, one planet in particular. Zentarazna held a great fascination for us. In that place, people had learned to shape their own bodies as they wished, to change them as it suited their fancy. Since Melisande and Ludmilla had grown tired of all the attention they got for their beauty, they quickly embraced the idea of taking on a strange image. We tried several, said Melisande. It was fun, like changing clothes in a dressing room, and not nearly as difficult to do as it is here, she added, turning to me and Sarah. Grandma shot her a glance, and I got the sense that they had not liked each other all those years ago. Of course, said Gaspar. Albert was always Albert, and Bob's wear problems had started back in Transylvania. They are who they are. It was Ludmilla, Melisande, and I who played at shape-shifting. In late October of 1948, there was a town-wide Halloween party. That was the last night I ever saw you, murmured Grandma. Gaspar nodded. The three of us had decided to go in our altered shapes, which seemed like the best of all possible costumes. Alas, that was the night that Martin discovered what we had been doing. A great argument broke out when we got home. Martin pulled out a strange weapon, something I had never seen before, and that's the last thing I remember until I found myself standing on the edge of your sink in the bathroom, looking up at Anthony and Sarah. Grandma squeezed his hand. I cried for a long time after you disappeared, she whispered. Gaspar shook his handsome head. I did not expect this, Ethel. My heart has gone into hiding, and I have no words left for what I feel. I was startled to see tears in his eyes, and then I realized that even though 50 years had gone by for Grandma, for Gaspar it was as if he had seen her last only the day before yesterday. Seen her young and beautiful, seen her as the woman he was going to marry, and now she was old. There was a great scandal, said Grandma softly. People suspected that Martin had killed you all, but there were no bodies, so the police couldn't put together a case. She shook her head. And all that time you were trapped in a box inside Morley Manor. Oh, Martin, I could just... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, though I wasn't sure if it was because she couldn't bring herself to say something violent in front of me and Sarah, or because she couldn't think of something bad enough to do to Martin. He wasn't really Martin, said Gaspar softly, though whether any of us ever can ever know our true self is a great question anyway. Those 50 years seemed only like a moment to us, said Melisande, but the world has changed so. We were only out for a few hours this morning, but it was as if we had gone to another planet. Had we not traveled before, been to Zentarazna and other strange places, I do not think I could have coped with all this. And now you need to travel again, murmured Grandma, awed and wonder in her voice. You need to go to the land of the dead to see my poor husband? Gaspar nodded. Well, she said, I'm going with you. Gaspar started to protest, but it was pointless. I knew that tone of voice. He had as much chance of talking Grandma out of going with us as I had of sprouting wings and flying. Though the way things have been going lately, I suppose even that wouldn't have surprised me. As for Grandma, she might have been astonished to see Gaspar, might even have felt the stirrings of old love, but there was no way she was going to miss a chance to visit Grandpa. Since Grandma could provide the needed connection for the trip, we had a long argument about whether or not Sarah and I should be allowed to go. Grandma thought it was too dangerous. We pointed out that we had already been through, but that didn't convince her. Even Sarah's pleading, which is usually quite effective, did not change Grandma's mind. It was only when I argued that we would probably be in more danger on our own than we would if we went with them that she relented. So at 11 o'clock that night, we returned to Morley Manor. There's one thing I don't get, said Sarah as we approached the house. If the key to making the trip is our connection to Grandpa, then why do we have to come back here to do it? 2 reasons, said Gaspar. First, the aura of magic is stronger here. That was one of the reasons we bought the house to begin with, of course, and our work over the years did a great deal to increase that. Besides, we can go deeper into the earth here, which makes the journey easier. So the land of the dead is underground? Asked Sarah. Not really. From what the Wentar told me, I don't think you can say it is in this world at all. Even so, going underground brings you closer to a certain kind of truth. By this time we had reached the house. Melisande shuddered when she saw the bulldozer parked out front. The feathers of doom did indeed sweep close to our family home today. Once we were inside, he led the way down the cellar stairs. He held Sarah's flashlight in one hand and in the other a broomstick to knock aside the cobwebs, which were so thick in some places that they looked like a gray silk wall. On the far side of the basement was a door that led to another stairway, one that took us even deeper into the earth. A stray cobweb brushed across my forehead. The air was cold and damp, and Bob began to whine. It's all right, boy, murmured Melisande, who was walking beside him. I counted 113 steps as we descended. Where did these stairs come from? Asked Sarah. Martin built them, of course, said Gaspar. At one time we would have done it together. He sounded bitter and wistful. Finally we reached the bottom. The chamber we entered was earthen-walled, but had a solid ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Gaspar instructed us to lie down and join hands. The dirt floor was cool and damp, but, he said, closeness to the earth was important. Leave space for me here, he said, talking to Grandma and me. We shifted apart, still holding hands for the time being. Now close your eyes, said Gaspar, turning off the flashlight. Why should we close our eyes? Asked Melisande. It's already dark. It will help move you deeper into yourself, said Gaspar quietly. I closed my eyes and listened as he worked. He was muttering to himself strange words that I couldn't make out. Every once in a while I heard him strike a match. I could see the flicker of light even though my eyes were closed. A pungent odor filled the room, a weird mingling of freshness and rot, sharp as vinegar, sweet as cider. My head began to whirl. Now think of those who have gone before, said Gaspar. A moment later I felt him separate my hand from Grandma's. He lay down between us, then took my hand in his. The soil was cool, damp, and firm beneath me. I felt almost as if I were lying in a grave. I turned my thoughts to Grandpa, thought of how much I wanted to see him, to tell him that I loved him. And suddenly I looked down and saw a long silver cord. With a start I realized that it was stretched back to my own body. Grandma was floating next to me, and near her I saw Sarah and Melisande. Gaspar was on the other side of me. Even Bob had made it through, looking as surprised as I had ever seen a Cocker Spaniel look. Ahead of us, all around us, was a vast space filled with a kind of milky mist. Floating through it were the figures of people, some of them sharply defined, others softened around the edges, so it was hard to make them out. Their moans and mutters filled the air. I looked down. All I saw was more mist. I had no idea how far above the ground we were, if there was even any ground at all. But I felt so light I had no fear of falling. "That way," said Grandma, suddenly, her voice strong and firm. A murmur of astonishment rose from the shapes floating around us. We followed her. I wasn't sure how we were moving. We didn't flap our arms or anything. It was more like you thought about where you wanted to go and just sort of moved in that direction. Ahead of us floated a spirit. Even from behind he looked familiar. I felt a thickness in my throat, a lump of emotion I couldn't swallow. "Hello, Horace," said Grandma softly. "We've come for a little visit." And that's the end of our chapter, boys and girls.